On behalf of LAMAKAAN, I welcome all of you. I am Naeem, and both of my good friends are here. Danish Majid is a very, very dear friend whose book launch also happened here. And he's been writing heavily about South Asian studies and especially Hyderabad. He worked with Siyasat.com, contributed a lot to the entire history of Hyderabad. And he has also been publishing a lot in other journals and newspapers and other publication houses. And he has consented to be here and also have a conversation with the author of the book, The Sirens of September. So without further ado, I'm so sorry that we have been a little late. My apologies. And I'm going to hand over the mic to Danish Majid to take care of the proceedings. So please join me in welcoming both Danish Majid and also the author of the evening, ZEENAT.
Intro. Before I start the conversation with the author of this excellent book, which I also endorsed, just a little background on police action. So, first off, let me get a show of hands. How many know what happened in 1948? Just a few.
After the independence.
Yeah, after the independence. Oh, my dad, he's lived it in a way, so he knows. So, the police action, it's seen as the third act of the tragedy that had engulfed the Indian subcontinent during 1947/48. The first act, A.G. Nurani, the author of The Destruction of Hyderabad, he describes the first act as the Punjab and Bengal riots. And then the second act, the 1947-48 Kashmir War. And the third one is police action itself. And this was a time when a lot of these princely states of Hyderabad, of India, their question was uncertain. After the paramountcy of the British had lapsed post their departure in 1947, they had the option to be independent, accede to India or Pakistan. But in most cases, if not all, independence was not exactly the most practical option. Yet you had a lot of princely rulers who wanted to maintain their own status quo with the power that they had over their own state of affairs without any Indian or Pakistani power hovering above them. So, but besides the partition violence, a lot of violence took place as a lot of these states were being integrated. जब इंज़माम हुआ बहुत सारे रियासतों का हिंदुस्तान में. And that violence and what happened with people during those interesting times, that's very much been swept under the rug or even under chronicled. So, and I'm glad that there's been a growing corpus of literature. I mean, other than just my book, there's been Manrit Sodhi Someshwar's Hyderabad, which was second in her own little partition trilogy. That was from Harper, as was mine, but from Penguin comes this book, The Sirens of September. I highly suggest you guys pick it up. It's a great book, and I really had a blast reading it, and just the way it blends history and some excellent prose. I think it's definitely a delightful read for anybody who picks it up. So, before I get on to asking questions, this is a book where very interesting, well-developed characters. And as Hyderabad was deciding its future, or in certain circumstances, its future was being decided for it, there were many people affected by it. And the lenses in this...
A lady Farishta.
Yeah, Farishta, she's one of the characters, yes.
Yeah.
So, and how police action plays out through the eyes of these very multi-layered characters, I just found it really phenomenal. So, my first question to you, ZEENAT, is the three main characters in this book through whom we get to see police action in 1948 play out. They're Farishte Ali Khan, sorry. She she's a young girl coming of age as she sees a lot of what's transpiring all over India and specifically her homeland of Hyderabad. And then there's General Ahmad al-Edrus. I'm sure many people know Edrus was the last commander of Hyderabad's army, the sovereign army. And then there's Darius Farooqat, very shrewd Parsi businessman who knows how to maneuver different circumstances and people, to say the least. How and why did you choose to pen this narrative through the eyes of these three characters?
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, it's off. Just push it. Yeah, hold on.
So my book has three different POVs, and Farishte is an aristocratic teenage girl, and she is the emotional anchor of the story. But given the time that it was, she could not have been everywhere. She could not have been in command room. She could not have been present in government meetings. But I wanted to show most of the story through her eyes, because I thought that when you're at that age, when you're that young, there's still hope. If there had been anyone connected to the Nizam's administration, they already knew the sense of uncertainty and the sense that their time was up slowly. It would have been a very depressing book, I think, if I had chosen to write it from a man's point of view and from somebody who was, and even if you contrast General Edrus's chapters, in every chapter he is worried about something. He had a lot of worries on his shoulders. So I think to write the whole book through his point of view would have been would have been as fresh, let me put it that way. And Darius, the other factor, I wanted him as a contrast to the others who were insiders, and he was ultimate outsider. And he had this disdainful view of Hyderabad and the Nawab culture. So I wanted to portray a person like that from the other side too.
Very interesting motley of characters, and since you mentioned Edrus, I'm sure a lot of people is remembered, especially by some of the older Hyderabadis. Some elders have told me, Ghaddar-e-Qaum, he's the one who sold out Hyderabad to the Indian army. But I like the fact that this book offers a little more nuance to that notion. And that's one of the reasons I was happy you definitely chose Edrus. And sorry.
Yeah, I'd like to say that if Edrus had sold himself to the Indian side, and why would he have died like broke and in one room at the Bangalore club? He could have secured a very good position for himself with the Indians, but he chose not to. And in fact, he was imprisoned by the Indians in 1950. They accused him of complicity in Laik Ali's escape, but afterwards he was cleared. But by that time he was just broken and he left Hyderabad.
I mean, the flash forwards in this book, I like how you really go back and forth between 47/48 and the 50s. Let's talk about the local flavor that you bring to this book. I really like the injection of the references of the Hyderabadi dishes, Shikampura isme, and there's the Dakkani identity, which Farishta's grandfather, he saw that as different from, the Nehruvian Indian identity. We even saw it different from the Pakistani identity as well. And there's some, references to, the Dholake Geet as well too. I like that. And Sunny, General Drus's son, he's talking when he's writing to his mother from Rawalpindi, because he serves in the army, right? Yeah, to Farishte. He says, "Oh, I miss the marg," which is our Arab dish, because Edrus lo jo the chaush the un log. So, was it challenged to keep that local flavor and at the same time make the narrative accessible to readers who don't know Hyderabad without making this too nostalgic or too hagiographic? Because we also see that Hyderabadis, they get the prose that I've read in Urdu and to English to a certain extent. It gets very hagiographic and a little too nostalgic. So, how did you balance that? Did the editor come into play with that?
The editor can explain the Urdu words. He said even if it's someone who doesn't know Urdu, not to over-explain, because that word was taken away from the text. He wanted them to understand through inference. But I think Hyderabadis to date food is very important. So I figured it's important then, it must have been important then, and I mean it's important now, so it had to be important then too. The food, the parties, the ceremonies, the bismillahs. So that has not changed. The weddings, I have, yeah. So that I had to, some customs that are practiced and they discontinue. So that I wanted to bring that flavor into what the everyday life would have been. I didn't want to overly glorify that everything was perfect, because even though I guess certain class of people didn't have that many challenges, but the political circumstances did through certain challenges at them, like the blockade, for example, and not having petrol.
Perfect segue into with historical fiction. Sometimes authors have a little more freedom to talk about unsavory realities. जो थोड़े तल्ख हकीकत है, आप historical fiction से ज़रा थोड़ा बयान कर सकते हैं. Me, I didn't really have that luxury too much, because certain realities of Hyderabad, which transpired and were very apparent in certain households, which I chronicled, I couldn't really mention them too much or even attribute them. But you don't really have that problem. So, for instance, the bad sides of Hyderabad, some things which I found in this. Farishta's grandmother throwing a slipper at the servant because she comes from a noble family. I've heard a lot of stories from elders about Nawaba, Chapana Pekna, Nokaron ke upar. And then Darius, the character who said doesn't really have any love lost for Hyderabadi culture. Although he says it in a very condescending way, he was right. The feudals of Hyderabad, they didn't really know how to manage money. The mercantile communities of Hyderabad, they're mostly from outside, the people who knew how to manage money. But there's also good sides to Hyderabad as well. You talk about Maharaja Kishan Prasad's wives. He had Hindu wives and Muslim wives, which reflects the very cosmopolitan, I won't say Ganga Jamni, but Isa Musi Tehzeeb of Hyderabad. And then there's the Nizam's generosity to a lot of his advisors. So was it difficult to straddle and reconcile these different aspects of Hyderabad? Because we do also know that Hyderabadis, they have a little extreme reverence for the erstwhile royalty and nobility. And Urdu writers like Wajda Tabassum are not looked upon too kindly. And I'm sure people know the book Days of the Beloved. Harriet Linton and Mohini Rajan, not too looked upon favorably here. So, what was it like straddling and reconciling these different aspects of Hyderabad?
Yeah, I think those days, some indentured slaves, they lived with the family from the time they were born till their death. And at times they were literally treated like slaves. And they were, but I did touch on it, but I didn't go into great detail about it, because as I could happen, but I didn't want, that wasn't really the focus of my book, but that was how aristocrats did not behave well with their servants, and also as we know that the Nawabs were not good with their finances. That's why a lot of them faced very difficult circumstances after the reception, because they were spendful and wasteful in their expenses, and they didn't plan for the future. So that led to their downfall to a certain extent. And the more positive aspects, the intermingling of cultures, I do touch upon that in some ways. And also the Nizam, a traveler visiting through Hyderabad mentioned that there's probably no ruler in history that displays as much benevolence to his subjects of alternative faith as the Nizam of Hyderabad. So that was a positive quality about him.
That kind of goes by a lot of older people that it's not that everybody was well off, but the poorer folks, they latched on to the nobility, and there were nobles who also treated these people well too. And you see that in certain non-Hyderabad based novels like Kurtula and Haidar's novels, because she's from a noble family, and she also talks about how a lot of servants to these scions of noble families, some of the female servants, they were equivalent to mothers as well. So just that's another thing I also want to bring up as well. Let's talk a little bit about the partition in the backdrop, because 1947, even though this is more so about 1948, the partition violence really lurks heavily in the background, especially when Farishte, she even goes to Bombay and visits some of these refugee camps. And I kind of was reminded of, Lenny in the book Ice Candyman by Babsi Sidhwa. And for those of you who don't know, 1947 Earth with Amir Khan and Nandita Das was based on Ice Candyman. So Farishte kind of really reminded me of that young girl who's witnessing a lot of violence and kind of coming of age. So I'm really glad that you brought it up as well too. But there may or may not have been people who said this partition backdrop is unnecessary. But why did you feel the need to add the partition backdrop?
Because directly affected by partition, in the sense they didn't have refugees coming there like they had in North India and Bombay, and refugees that came from Sindh by ship. So I had in one chapter, Farishte visits Bombay on holiday, and then she is taken to a refugee camp where Sindhi refugees from have their camp in Mazgaon, and she witnesses them actually sleeping on flattened cardboard boxes and so on. And that was her real exposure. She says that the photos and articles she read about partition in newspapers, she said she couldn't imagine that the situation of the refugees was that bad until she actually saw them in Bombay.
And we do see a lot of reportage from that time, especially that photo of that kid. He's standing atop like a little hill, and then his hands on his head, just making sense of all the violence. So speaking of reportage, a lot of reportage, for my book, came in handy. Okay, some of the features I did, whether it was for Siyasat.com, Mint Lounge, Hindu Business Line Inc., The Wire, and you've written for some of these outlets as well too.
Yeah.
So how much of that reportage, the research for that, how much of that was handy for when you wrote this piece of fiction?
So the first article I wrote for Siyasat was actually on the 4-day war. So that definitely came in handy when I was writing the chapters about pertaining to the 4-day invasion. Then I wrote another one about the Falaknuma library for the Mint Lounge, Hindustan Times. And I went to the Falaknuma library and I took photos of the books, and I used those names in my book, as those books made an appearance in Farishta's grandfather's study. And then there was another article I wrote about the period before the period of the Sixth Nizam and their shikars, where when they cut a cake, tiny colorful birds came out of the cake. And during the shikars, I believe champagne used to flow from waterfalls. So that all was very useful, for building this world of my book.
Used world building. So I wanted to ask, what books were particularly helpful for this research and building these worlds? Because in my second draft, my editor, he had me do some extra research. He said, build the world. Pull the reader who's unfamiliar with this into this world, and do that through a lot of primary sources, secondary sources, English, Urdu. But I had to use footnotes. You didn't have to do that.
Yeah.
So which books came in handy? I want to know. I am sure Idrus's 7 Loaves definitely came in handy, and Muhammad Haidar's October Coup, because you do refer to a collector from Usmanabad, which I think is him, and maybe Mir Likeley's Tragedy of Hyderabad. So which books were particularly helpful to you?
Yeah, those 3, of course. Also, Sidney Cotton's biography, The Last Plane Out of Berlin, to get information about the weapons smuggling. And the world building, actually newspapers from that time helped a lot, as to what movies were playing, what books were out, what kind of cream they used to set their hair, what hair oil they used, so what the name of their baby food was. So yeah, books, the newspapers were handy for that. A lot of YouTube clips also came in handy. And movies from the 1940s, even though didn't watch any set in Hyderabad as such, but World War II period movies to see how the transport was, how people dressed, how they spoke, how their telephones were, things like that.
And
Oh yes, one more thing. Visiting the Chowmela Palace and seeing their crockery, their furnishings, their clothes, their cars. Yeah.
And speaking of a lot of research, I'm just wondering how much, if you're at liberty to talk about some of that, some of how you got to, creating that little correspondence between Farishta's grandfather, who's going all out to ensure the independence of Hyderabad to very subversive means, because there's a lot of interaction between him and General Edrus. So a lot of sounds like very confidential stuff, even though if it's a fiction, even though it's a fiction book. So how much of that was creative liberty, or are you not at liberty to talk about answer that question?
I did use a lot of creative liberty, of course. General Edrus talks about it in his memoir of his trips to Europe and him staying at the Dorchester Hotel where he's caught by Lord Mountbatten. And Sidney Cotton mentions it. And there's a very interesting character whom I didn't mention in the novel, a gentleman by the name of Charles Henry Luschwitz. He was director of music for the Nizam's army. So he was the one who liaised between the army officers. There was other than Edrus, there was a colonel and some colonels and other officers involved in this whole weapons smuggling business. And also a Nawab name was mentioned and some civilians. So they were all in this project in some level. There was a lot of money exchanged hands, and it was all done surreptitiously. But there's a lot of stuff that I didn't know, but I had to bridge the gaps. There's actually, if you look up Charles Henry Luschwitz, it just came up that there was a court case going on as late as the late 1960s, where a court of England tried Mufa Kamja and these other people in that weapons smuggling case. And Nehru actually flew in 7 prosecution witnesses to London, including Luschwitz and some Nawab and some army officers. They had to go and give evidence in London. But it's still a mystery as to what became of those millions of pounds, because even Sidney Cotton didn't make up out with that many. But a lot of those were flown out of Hyderabad in suitcases to Pakistan. So somebody made a lot of money in that. But the trail runs cold. We don't know what happened to all that money.
I mean, even Express Tribune, I still read articles about what happened to that money. Dawn, even in Dawn, I read certain op-eds about that. So it's interesting to see that topic is still in vogue on the other side of the border.
Oh yeah, on the other side of the border, these books would do very well, but we're not allowed to sell these books. They're very interested in what happened.
So, but the only objection I have in this book, sorry to pick up this little flaw. So on page 193, you write, an opaque film formed in the man's cataract-afflicted eyes. He backed away from me and folded his withered hands. His silent rejection wounded me more than the crowd's clamor about Pakistan and the Razakars. Hyderabad's ruling elite was so proud of the state's history of peaceful coexistence between Muslims and Hindus. It had all been a sham. I mean, a lot of that is true, as I even write in my book that, Hyderabad, they're good, it had its good sides and its bad sides. And whether it was Jammu Kashmir or princely Hyderabad, it was ultimately a minority hovering over a religious majority. So, though I will say this, like the Nizam, he did patronize a lot of temples as well. In Bansi Raja, there's a Mehboob Ali Pasha's right-hand man, he was known as Bansi Raja, he's the Kayast. And I found a book written about him by one of his great-grandsons. So in that he writes that the Keshavgiri temple in Chandrayan Gutta, the Nizams patronized those temples as well. And you do allude to these the good side as well too. But I'm just wondering why, like, that specific fact of, the patronage of a lot of temples, why that was left out. Was it just because of this being a result of just how the communal landscape and the communal situation had reached a boiling point, and the Hindu-Muslim tensions had also been reaching their peak in Hyderabad as well?
So my book doesn't really focus on whether the Nizam built places of worship or schools or or libraries. It wasn't really, that wasn't my objective. But I do think it wasn't fair for Urdu to be the language of administration and to make everyone wear sherwanis. Maybe it was not going to last. You cannot impose one's culture on 10% cannot impose on the rest and expect them to last. It couldn't have lasted. So they were a bit short-sighted maybe in that respect.
It is said that the Qutub Shahi dynasty, they were a little more linguistically encompassing in that they did accord the same amount of respect they did to Urdu and Persian, to Telugu as they did to Urdu and Persian as well. I mean, the Dakkani, the older Dakkani, the original Dakkani, it's a mix of all these three, and it's spoken more so in the districts. Hum log jo hai, city Dakkani zyada se zyada bolte. It's more influenced by the North Indian Urdu, because during the first Nizam and the subsequent Nizams, Persian and Urdu, things became more Persianized and Urduized. So I will agree with you to a certain extent on that. But let's talk a little bit more about the structure of the novel, because like me, everybody here is not a fiction writer. I'm a reader of fiction. I love reading it, but I cannot write it. That's why my poison is non-fiction. So the structure, I noticed the novel, it's divided into three parts. The first part is titled 1947. The second one, 1948. The third one, The Invasion. So, and forgive me if this is a bit of an elementary question as a non-fiction writer, but was the three-act structure, the three-act structure for a novel, was that what was in play when you were formulating the plot, the structure? Because the first act is the setup, which I think, at least in my mind, is 1947. 1948, that's when the confrontation begins. And then the invasion, that's where the resolution happens as well. Was that where?
So it broadly fits into so it's really until the end of 1947, things are not that, things are somewhat under control. 1948, things slowly start to implode with Hyderabad, with the Indian government tightening its screws on Hyderabad, and Farishta's family start also trying to feel the pinch. And of course that lasts until September 48, when the invasion happens and the aftermath will upset everybody. So the three-act structure is, in the three-act structure, the second act is usually the longest. It's like about half of the book. And sometimes the second act is divided into three, so there's also the five-act structure.
Oh.
So, but broadly, yeah, I think I did keep those, the rising action, the first initiating incident, the second, all of those, I did keep those in mind while I was writing. The falling action, the climax, resolution, that was all there.
And one other question I'd like to ask pertaining to, the actual writing, the structure. Right? I've also worked with an editor on this. How important is the editor's role especially in a fiction novel, would you say?
So my editor gave me a lot of freedom. He just told me to rewrite some scenes or to add a bit more detail. He didn't really change the structure as such. Yeah.
The prose.
The book was already in place. Yeah. By the time it got to an editor.
Mm-hmm. How long did that process take?
So I've had editors. I had the literary agency also had my book read by an editor. So went through some revisions there, and they said this aspect needs to be worked on. Something wasn't working. So I would say that by the time it got to the publisher, the edits were minor. They were not that substantial. And then copy editing, of course, doesn't really change the structure of the novel.
And last question before we open. I'm hopeful for a sequel. I know it's a bit of a long shot, but do you think we'll get to see, a sequel, in 80s or 90s or 2000s Hyderabad where Farishte and Edrus's great grandchildren they meet up maybe in Hyderabad, Pakistan, or Australia, UK, US, Canada, Chicago, one of the
Global
The
citizens.
hubs.
yeah, one of the hubs, or even Toronto, where there are so many Hyderabadis. Do you think that scenario could materialize in the form of a sequel?
So everyone's been asking me, are you writing another book? I have to confess I haven't had the spark for an idea, but thank you, Danish, for giving that spark. But the only thing is that the way things are with Hyderabadi families, if I had Farishta's grandchildren in the picture, they would probably be all fighting about property and going to court. It's very typical. Whoever has property is going fighting court cases. That is, when it's so prevalent, you have to include it because a lot of people relate to that.
What could be a background?
Definitely.
But some people that's their life, is just going to court cases. I mean, every second person I know has got some property that's under dispute and they're fighting with their cousin or somebody. Yeah.
I could definitely give you some ideas regarding, Hyderabadi Pakistani families and the Hyderabadi families who remained in India.
Hyderabad.
And one of my subjects, the Hyderabadi Pakistani, his cousin is right here as well. So
Yeah.
maybe we'll connect with you later as well. So anyway, so yeah, that's pretty much it for me. I'd definitely love to hear from everybody in the audience. Questions, comments, concerns.
When you were a debater.
But the reason I'm here is not just because ZEENAT is my schoolmate, but because she has written about a very important part of our country's history that Hyderabad shares. And I really liked how ZEENAT answered the last question that it's about the lost era and longing. I think a lot of us in Hyderabad have that feeling. A good sequel can be what could Hyderabad have been hypothetically if it had remained independent, right?
That's
It's
what is-
impossible,
what is
but
that?
imagine how it would have been. Hyderabad had everything that a modern city seeks to have. Today,
And ahead of its
Hyderabad, we are talking about the Musi River front redevelopment, whereas it was done so 100 years back or 200 years back. Sabarmati River has been redone now, riverfront, and we had it all. So culturally we had a lot, engineering wise we had a lot, we had rail system,
Natural resources.
we had natural resources, and we had tamed the floods of Hyderabad. So Hyderabad was actually ahead of its time in this Indian subcontinent.
Yeah.
So it's a great tragedy that Hyderabad was given the amber light or even the red light to stop, so that the rest of the country could move ahead. So I don't have any personal stories to add to your lovely setting here, ZEENAT, but I just have these ideas that why as a country have we slowed down some bright spots of our entire country to accommodate that the rest of the country should catch up, and why should we be defensive about a culture or a people like the other gentleman pointed out. So it's okay. Each state, each city has its own momentum, right? Each civilization has its own momentum. So we are lucky to be part of that. That's what my view is.
Go with the flow.
Thank you for bringing it out so well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Vishnu.
राइटर दानिश मजीद, हम लोग दोनों की उर्दू थोड़ी इनकी सर अच्छी है, हम लोग दोनों की थोड़ा अंग्रेज़ी स्टाइल की उर्दू है, इनके थोड़ा अमेरिकन स्टाइल का है, लेकिन उन्हें उर्दू स्कॉलर भी है। तो दानिश मजीद साहब की बुक द हैदराबादीज़ ये हार्पर कॉलिंस में रिलीज़ कर रहे थे इन
अप्रैल में।
अप्रैल, और मेरा नावल साइरेंस ऑफ सितंबर वाज रिलीज्ड बाय पेंगुइन ये सितंबर लास्ट मंथ। और हमारे दोनों की बुक्स हैदराबाद के ऊपर है। मेरा फिक्शन स्टोरी है ऑपरेशन पोलो के बारे में, और दानिश के रियल लाइफ अकाउंट्स है 10 फैमिलीज के बारे में। और आज हम लोग लामकान में एक बुक टॉक कर रहे थे हम लोग दोनों के बीच।
कौन से एरिया में
कौन से एरिया में
हुआ ये प्रोग्राम?
ये प्रोग्राम? अच्छा, ये बंजारा हिल्स लामकान।
माजिद है, मैं किताब द हैदराबादी फ्रॉम 1947 टू द प्रेजेंट डे का मुसन्नफ़ हूँ। और ये है मोहतरमा ज़ीनत खान, उन्होंने भी हाल ही में एक किताब पब्लिश करवाए, तो वो भी पेंगुइन नाशिर से। उसका उन्वान है द साइरेंस ऑफ सितंबर। और आज उनके साथ गुफ्तगू हुई मेरी अच्छी उनकी किताब के बारे में। और खुशी की बात यह है कि अब हैदराबाद के बारे में और कहानियाँ मंजर आम पे आ रही, चाहे वो मेरी किताब हो नॉन फिक्शन में या उनकी हिस्टोरिकल फिक्शन में, क्योंकि कुछ ज़्यादा ही देर से एक फुकदान रहा है हैदराबाद के लिटरेचर के बारे में, वो भी खुसूसन वो 1948 के वाक़या के बारे में।